One Piece is back. An old man got punched, a cyborg man got kicked, and another cyborg man got a lovely hug from his non-cyborg daughter. Aww. Meanwhile, two-time defending world champion Nico Robin is about to face her third Buster Call and go for a new world record. Exciting stuff. But before any of that though, there is a thing we need to talk about, and that thing is rats, or our rats, because the cover page is just adorable. I love the idea of Sanji serving at a teeny tiny restaurant with the rats getting engaged, and it probably feels like a bit of a random idea, but this cover page holds a lot more meaning than you may initially think. Going all the way back to his childhood, Sanji got his start in the culinary arts by cooking for rats, which led to the iconic Vinsmoke judge panel, where he orders Sanji to never cook again. And now every time there's a bad opinion on One Piece Twitter, someone without fail always posts that panel. Then during Onigashima, Sanji saved Osame's pet rat Chuji, whilst he was delivering the finishing attack on Queen, no less. And rats are very symbolic, by the way, because they're often considered the absolute lowest life form of society. Very similar to how humans are treated by the world government, especially in this case because Saturn was experimenting on them, but also quite similarly to how pirates are treated by other humans. So Sanji has a habit of cooking for rats, both literal and metaphorical. And the whole cover is also very evocative of Whole Cake Island with the wedding cake, and the female rat is even wearing quite a similar dress to Charlotte Pudding and making one of her trademark poses as well. I don't often enjoy cover pages to this extent, but this is a great piece of artwork that encapsulates all the core aspects of Sanji and references the long journey that he's been on to get to where he is today. Now, as for actual events, thankfully we pick up exactly where we left off, which feels like a month ago at this point. I guess it was technically last year. And Kuma lands what I think might be the best punch in all of the One Piece, even better than Charlos. And I don't know, I guess we'll have to wait until it's animated to fully judge its impact, but it's been a long time, a very long time, since I've been so satisfied by a single attack. I'm not sure about you guys, but this lands much harder for me than even Luffy's final attack against Kaido, and it's all about the build-up. Because the chapter starts with an abridged Kuma flashback, and something I really liked were the images Oda chose to use of both Ginny and Bonnie. Firstly, because I love that in these memories, Kuma remembers Ginny as he met her, rather than what she became after Saturn's experiments, which is exactly what Ginny wanted. And that flashback child Ginny transitions perfectly into a very similar pose from a modern day child Bonnie. So what we have happening here is generational retribution. There's a thread of pain that traveled from Saturn into Ginny to Bonnie to Kuma's fist, and finally returned right into the wrinkled face of Saint Saturn. So it's a beautiful thread to follow. And I love the panel of Kuma right before the impact. It's quite similar to the one at the end of chapter 1103, but I don't know if I've ever seen a One Piece character attack with this much implied power. And really, it's all about the teeth. The perspective shot of the panel really makes the teeth look so much bigger than they actually are. I mean, the surface area of those teeth in this one panel could house hundreds, perhaps thousands of Revolutionary Army refugees. That's how much space they take up. But it's the grit teeth that really gives you the feeling of power behind the punch rather than the punch itself. And even though it is a bit repetitious, I do appreciate seeing it again. Although it does make me wonder if this might have been the original plan to end 1103 with, but then Oda, I don't know, ran out of pages. Because it does feel like we needed to replay the events here for the first two pages just to get us back to the same point we were already at. And I have to admit, as much as my personal agenda is to inflict as much violence upon Saint Saturn as humanly possible, I do love this resilient look in the panel right before we see the full impact. It's this look of furious superiority. Like Saturn is definitely acknowledging what's happening here and cannot believe that this scum of the earth would dare lay a mega fist on his wrinkled yet heavenly and divine face. But this is everything I've wanted, and it comes with so much more weight than even, say, Luffy punching St. Charlos, because Kuma is a former slave attacking the world's highest authority. So you've got the very lowest standing up to the very highest. And I do hope that Kuma's actions get reported back to the Revolutionary Army, because that's the kind of inspiring story that could drive a lot of people to stand up for themselves and take action, especially if Saturn ends up going down for good in this arc. But even though this arc has been a deep dive into the mysteries of Kuma, this chapter opens up a brand new one. Saturn mentions that he's already activated the self-destruct mechanism, which good on him. He's a horrible old spider ghoul, but I have to give him consistent credit for making what seems to be all of the smart moves at the very least. I actually love his strategy here, and I think there's a really great argument to be made for allowing the Revolutionary Army to take Kuma. Let them bring bring the big bear bomb back to their headquarters, give them a couple of days, think, everything went well, and then casually erase the core of their operation with a single strike. So it would have been great if there actually was a bear bomb. As suspected, Vegapunk decided to go with a less literal interpretation of self-destruct and instead installed what appears to be a mind and body shutdown function. And with this, I think we finally have our answer as to why Kuma flipped out of nowhere. The Revolutionary Army rescued Kuma. Saint Saturn said, "No worries, mate. I, Saint Saturn, have this under control." Then he sat down and he waited just long enough for Kuma to be taken back to headquarters and then went, "Now," and pressed the button. At which point, instead of shutting down, Kuma did, well, not that, because he was finally free from taking any orders. It released that restriction on him, and whatever the special Buccaneer trait is, allowed Kuma's body this sliver of free will to go and do all of the things it is he did. Which is fantastic, because Saturn is now ultimately responsible for what could be his own demise. By insisting on a self-destruct mechanism, he did what world nobles do best, and he went that one step too sadistic. If he didn't go that one extra step, then everything probably would have worked out for him. But he pushed it that little bit too far, so much so that Vegapunk felt morally compelled to act. If Saturn hadn't demanded this function, then everything probably would have gone his way on Egghead Island. But the new mystery is the true power of the Buccaneer race, and Vegapunk, well, he has an idea of exactly what this is. It's not an idea that he's chosen to share with the rest of us, unfortunately. Well, at least not beyond the word love. But up until now, the special trait of the Buccaneer race has been assumed to be their chonksome tanky nature. But it may actually be something much deeper and less apparent to the very logical eyes of scientists like Vegapunk and Saturn. And it might have been something that was much more obvious when there was an entire race of them. The world government probably didn't just want them eliminated because of their physical power or whatever crime they committed. But at the same time, it's very on point for the world government to disregard the value of any life beyond what physical labor it can provide. So whatever this special trait of the Buccaneer race is, and however much it ends up costing the world government on Egghead Island, it is entirely on the hubris of the world government for not being inquisitive enough to discover it, and therefore not being able to plan for it. So that, along with the self-destruct thing, means that Saturn has double doomed himself here. But other than the punch, the definite highlight of the chapter for me was Bonnie's reunion with Kuma. Because as much as I feel bad for Kuma's situation, at least he was able to make peace with it. He was perfectly happy to never see Bonnie again, so long as it meant that she got to go on and live a long, full life. Now, Bonnie, on the other hand, really needed this physical closure, which is made all the more touching because Kuma picking Bonnie up is very deliberately positioned like the very first time he met her in the Sorbet Kingdom Cathedral. Except in that case, Kuma was holding Ginny rather than Bonnie. And that's important because this is a full circle moment. Kuma failed to protect Ginny, and he didn't know this at the time, but he failed to protect her very specifically from Saint Saturn. So that was a very emotional hug of sadness, despair, regret, and all of the other pain words, but also resolution. Resolution to make sure that that didn't happen to Bonnie. And Kuma keeps his promise here, bending down to embrace his daughter, having saved her from Saint Saturn, and bringing the whole Ginny-Bonnie saga to a nice bookend. And even though we don't know how much, if any, of Kuma actually remains in this body, Bonnie still got the opportunity to thank her father and tell him how much she appreciates him. And say stuff like, "No matter if the whole world calls you a tyrant, I will still know how cool you were, Dad." But the sweetest thing was when Bonnie recognized Ginny and said that her mother was an amazing woman. And again, Ginny gets her last wish because Bonnie only has Kuma's memories and thus will only remember her mother the way he did. But part of me is also wondering if this moment might be giving Bonnie a bit of false hope for the future. Because yes, in theory, she perfectly understands what's happened to Kuma, but him appearing here could give Bonnie the idea that this story might have a happy ending. As if all they need to do now is escape Egghead Island and then they get to travel the world together. But then Kuma stops moving. And I wonder if what we're heading towards is a going merry moment, where Kuma becomes physically unsalvageable and we give him a hero's funeral after he assists us in escaping from some sort of buster call. It really is very similar to the going merry situation, isn't it? Now, this chapter was also fantastic for those craving some good old Sanji Frankie action, and I am one of those. Egghead Island has been very Luffy Zoro heavy so far, and it's always nice to see the other Straw Hats kick into gear. And Sanji did what Sanji does by coming to the rescue of a young lady, very chivalrous, and generally great to see a Straw Hat attacking an Elder Star. Although Frankie, mate, he was the real deal here. You see, I was under the impression that Sanji was the chef. But in this chapter, Frankie makes us a beautiful donut when he sends a radical beam straight through Saturn's body. Of course, Saturn can regenerate though, in a very evil, twisty sort of way as well. And it's always amazing to see how authors handle regeneration abilities, because as soon as that becomes apparent, you can see the narrative inhibitors lifted. I swear, in any shonen manga, as soon as a character can regenerate, they become as fragile fragile as sugar glass, taking fatal wound after fatal wound, losing limb after limb, whilst every other character remains as tough as obsidian and is impossible to permanently damage. I'm really hoping that this doesn't start a trend of antagonist regeneration though, because that's something that can get quite tiring once it's an established requirement. But at the same time, I'm remembering all of the antagonists we have left. There's the rest of the Elders and Emu that probably share whatever demonic trait Saint Saturn has. Then you've got Sakazuki and Ryukugyu, who are both Logia users, and even Blackbeard's a Logia user, although it might not function in the same way as standard Logias. So most of the major villains left are definitely on the more regeneration side of things. And the same goes for Kizaru, who then quite rudely interrupted Frankie's fight battle, and we'll talk more about his wandering morality in a bit. But this part reminded me of something I love so much about Oda's art style, which is how he portrays light. Because One Piece is a very bright manga with minimal shading, it's actually impossible for Oda to draw something any brighter than his neutral style. So to create light, what Oda has to do is employ darkness with super stark shading, which gives the remaining neutral elements the illusion of being way brighter when they haven't actually changed at all. So it's a fun visual oxymoron. To create light, what you actually need to do is create darkness. But back to characters, this chapter leaves Kizaru in a very precarious position because it would seem that Egghead is continuing to touch what few feelings it is that he seems to possess. I love his line at the end of the chapter about how he should have worn darker sunglasses. It's like the One Piece equivalent of "It's a terrible day for rain." Except with the facial expression Kizaru's giving, you can't quite tell if he's being sarcastic or not. As per usual with this admiral, you could read his vague emotions in any direction. Like I said in the discussion video about Kizaru potentially redeeming himself, it looks like he is at the very least determined to kill Vegapunk because that was the exact wording of his mission. He was supposed to protect Punk Records, the power plant, and York, and he was supposed to eliminate Dr. Vegapunk. Now, as it stands, everything he was ordered to protect is now being kind of revoked by Saint Saturn's Buster Call, so Kizaru only has one standing order left, and it looks like he's at least about to try and carry it out. But outside of Vegapunk, Kizaru's got some feels going on, and this might be a stretch, but I do think he's doing what he can to protect everyone else within the bounds of his mission. Frankie, for example. In this chapter, Kizaru does kick him, which is a traditionally hostile activity, but it comes after some very thought-provoking words. Frankie says that they owe a lot to Kuma, which, by the way, he's the perfect person to deliver this line because he was the only one to encounter Kuma post-time skip when he got back to the Thousand Sunny. So Frankie understands this debt on a completely different level to the rest of the crew. And Kizaru does agree with this and actually uses that to challenge the Straw Hats, to see how much good Kuma's actions ultimately did. And that in and of itself is quite telling, because Kizaru is the kind of man who usually doesn't speak unless absolutely necessary and is generally a bit too lost in his own mind to even pay attention to what other people around him are saying. So Kizaru does recognize on some level that the Straw Hats are part of Kuma's legacy. So I do think it's possible that Kizaru might have kicked Frankie not to injure him, but to protect him from Saint Saturn, because Frankie got in a pretty painful looking attack that surely would have been met with furious demonic retribution if Saturn were left to handle the situation on his own. There's even a mid-shot panel of Saturn immediately after the kick where he's all like, "Really? I mean, that was unnecessary. Kinda had things under control there, Kizaru. I am an older star and all, but thanks anyway." So again, at the moment, I don't think Kizaru is going to do a full flip, but there's definite emotional conflict happening here. And the general theme with every Admiral character is them coming to terms with justice and questioning the decisions of those they serve. Fujitora, for one, was always pursuing his own justice, even if it involved directly thwarting the world government. In fact, especially if it involved that. Meanwhile, the goodest of boys, Fleet Admiral Sakazuki, has been struggling with the lack of resources to implement his sense of justice, as well as enthusiasm from the Five Elders. And then, of course, Kuzan left the Marines in pursuit of his own ideals. So it's time to challenge Kizaru as well. And much like Kuzan on Ohara, I think that Kizaru might have a sneaky impact that results in the crew being able to escape. Otherwise, what we have right now is a 2-on-2. Sanji and Frankie versus Kizaru and Saturn. Not an amazing matchup. So we really need Luffy back in the picture right about now, which is exactly what Oda didn't do. In fact, Oda went out of his way to take Luffy out of the picture he was already in. The main character of this manga didn't appear in any pictures this week, despite the fact that he was right there in the midst of the action in the last chapter. Luffy was suspiciously absent, only mentioned in a single panel where the Marine stated that he disappeared, which is a very un-Luffy-like thing to do. And this might just be some more swamp cope on my part, but Caribou could have absorbed him and give Luffy the opportunity for some sort of sneak attack. At this point, I'm just not sure what else could be going on with Luffy. We have the mystery food and now the mystery disappearance. So if not swamp, then what? But in response to everything, Saint Saturn has more or less said, F it, we're just going to solve this problem the same way that we, the world government, solve every other problem. Mass destruction and or genocide. So he orders a busticle, and fair play to him because there's a lot of problems currently happening on Egghead Island. Saturn cites that they've been researching the Void Century, also the last rogue buccaneer and an emperor of the sea who has taken on the form of an ancient god prophesied to bring down their entire world order. So if I was faced with all of those problems, I would be very keen to solve them with a series of violent explosions. But the thing to keep in mind is that this is not an ordinary busticle. This isn't O'Hara and this is not any Sobby. Both of those situations were horrific, but they were subject to a normal busticle, which consists of 10 marine battleships. But on Egghead Island, we have 100 ships. That's 10 times the firepower of a regular busticle, as well as an admiral, an elder star, and a gaggle of bonus vice admirals that would normally be there. And we should also briefly spare a thought for Nico Robin, because this is now the third busticle that's been initiated directly on her. Most people don't live beyond their first busticle, but this is Robin's third in 30 years. That's an average of a busticle once every decade. So will Nico Robin go on to survive this busticle? Well, yes, obviously, it's a story, but the question is more, how will she survive it this time? I can't wait to find out, and you'll know as soon as I do, so long as you press that subscribe button for consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feeds.